Hi, this is Peter Beal, and in this lecture I want to talk a little bit about developments in art in the Italian peninsula from about 1300 maybe to 1400. This is really critical for the future sort of trajectory path of Western art in general. Italy stands in a very interesting place geographically. It's between the influence of the really wealthy and powerful, although less so by this time, but still quite powerful Byzantine Empire to the east. The emerging monarchies of France and Spain are to the northwest. We are also seeing at this point in time a renewed interest in the art and architecture of the Roman Empire. We see this, for instance, in the Kingdom of Sicily with Frederick II to around the middle or so of the 13th century. So in many ways, Italy is right at the crossroads of the sort of newly emerging culture and politics and economy of Western Europe. When we look at the map of Italy, which we're seeing right here, you can see a variety of different political entities present. The most important for our purposes in terms of the study of art are the republics. These are relatively small city-states. Florence is probably the biggest of them, and we might argue for Venice, especially as it begins to expand itself on the mainland. The republics are primarily commercial centers. They've made their money, especially in finance and trade, and to a certain degree in manufacturing, as in Florence. So we see, again, most important right there in the sort of northern area here, the Republic of Florence and the Republic of Venice. Elsewhere, we might see dukedoms, such as the Duchy of Milan, the Duchy of Ferrara, where we have a single, in essence, a dictator running the show, especially, for instance, in Milan with the Visconti and so on. If you're looking to sort of round out the list, we have the Papal States in the middle of the Italian peninsula right here, the boot, as it were, with the city of Rome to the south. And then further south, the Kingdom of Naples and Kingdom of Sicily. Especially Naples is aligned closely with Spain. And in terms of artistic interest at this point is, I think it's important, but we'll set it to one side for now. The situation, as I mentioned, of Italy is an interesting one. And from the roughly 1300 to about 1450, while these individual states, city-states and dukedoms and what have you, are quarreling amongst each other, there isn't a sense of a larger entity pressing down, especially from the west or the north. That begins to change, especially after 1494 with the invasion of Charles VII from France. And then from that point on, the notion of small independent city-states is pretty much obsolete. As I mentioned already, the city-states of Florence and Venice are particularly prosperous, trade and finance, bringing quite a lot of income. And art becomes a priority for the citizens of these places as a means, I think, primarily of establishing civic identity. And certainly the communes themselves, the city-states, are interested in promoting themselves via visual means. And there's also an interest in the new Christian monastic orders of Franciscanism and the Dominicans in creating and decorating churches that are newly located in these urban centers. A great example, for instance, in Florence would be the Franciscan Church of Santa Croce. So between the civic sort of pride of places like Florence, the renewed kind of religious art from the Franciscans and Dominicans, and of course a kind of new sense perhaps of individual identity and self-assertion on the part of these new merchant bankers and manufacturers and what have you, there's a lot of money and opportunity and interest in art. And some of that's going to be provided especially by the presence right there in the Italian peninsula, and literally in as in interred in the earth, the presence of actual sculpture and architectural remains from the Roman Empire. And as I mentioned already, importation, especially strong by the time we come into the 14th century, especially strong from the Byzantine Empire, new interest in painting. And then a great deal of activity, particularly in the north of France, in the style that we know as the Gothic. And this is definitely seen in church architecture, for instance, in Italy. Perhaps less so in terms of stained glass, but certainly in terms of sculpture as well. So the three major influences that we'll think about visually are going to be Gothic from the northwest, the sort of native Roman legacy that I think is quite important, and then from the east, the ideas of strategies and concepts of Byzantine art. We can see, for instance, in this piece here by Nicola Pisano from about 1260, I think, thereabouts. And this is from a baptistry pulpit in Pisa, so this is a sort of extra outside adjunct building, I guess. A really quite striking scene here of a combination of the Annunciation and Nativity, where a very Roman-looking Virgin Mary reclining here, which is very common in Etruscan and Roman sarcophagi, is here with the infant Jesus. We can see right here, again, very influenced by Roman sculpture, the angel Gabriel announcing to Mary that she's going to have this child. The scene is definitely crowded with figures, and there's not a great deal of naturalism in terms of space, but nevertheless the figures show a kind of sturdiness and monumentality that, at least in some part, derived from Roman examples, which the artist would have had access to right there in Pisa. If we look from the Byzantine side, we can see very clearly in this 1235 panel painting by Bonaventura Berlinghieri an image of St. Francis and some episodes from his legend. St. Francis dies in 1226, so this was painted less than a decade after his death. It was clearly intended to promote the cult of the saint, that is to say, the traditions, ideas, stories, and just a general religious enthusiasm for St. Francis. It's painted in a style that certainly would be called primarily Byzantine, sometimes also called the Italo-Byzantine, as it begins to shift away from strict Byzantine pictorial strategies. We can see a very frontal and static St. Francis right here, flanked by episodes from his life, miracles, primarily that of the receiving of the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, which are displayed on his hands and feet right here, so to make that identification with Christ really clear. His preaching to the birds is seen just below that, and it gives a sense overall of a saint who worked among the people and who tried to make their lives better, something the Franciscans, I think, clearly based much of their appeal on. And Franciscan art and Franciscan themes are an important part of the early history of Italian art, moving from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. That Italo-Byzantine style underwent further evolution as we go through the end of the 13th century, and this is seen in a very well-known comparison based upon the rough approximate placement in the Uffizi of the artist Cimabue and his Madonna enthroned, compared with Giotto's Madonna enthroned. Cimabue's example dating from about 1290 and Giotto probably around 1310. Both are altarpieces. They were intended to be hung in the really cavernous interior of a large church as a kind of visual marker of the presence of the altar and the actions there. So they have a very reflective and kind of monumental quality to them. Cimabue clearly reflects some of that two-dimensionality that we saw, for instance, in the Berlinghieri panel. He's softened it up and humanized, I think, the Virgin Mary to a certain degree, but his sense of light and space is somewhat, I think, two-dimensional and perhaps a little capricious and arbitrary, the use of gold leaf, for instance, to suggest the folds of drapery. That's changed quite a bit in Giotto's work, where he suggests very clearly modeling, that is to say, a sort of gradation between light and shade to show mass. The sense of volume that's present in all these figures is unmistakable and quite different from Cimabue. And if we look at his creation of a kind of space here within the sort of frame of the altarpiece, these are quite large, over 10 feet in height typically, we'll see a real sense of development of atmosphere, a kind of what art historians describe as a pictorial envelope in which these painted figures, these two-dimensional figures, appear to exist in a three-dimensional reality. So if we were thinking about naturalism as a criteria for judging a painting, I think it's very clear that Giotto's painting is more successful in all those ways that I just described: space, mass, volume, the sense of handling of light. It corresponds to our own sort of lived experience, our visual experience. And so it's very common in histories of Renaissance art to talk about Giotto as this great pioneer in naturalism. It's probably more productive to think about changing priorities in terms of what visual art was supposed to do, these altarpieces having a very clear functional existence as well as an aesthetic one, that perhaps simply, instead of thinking of progress, that we think about these altarpieces as changing from one set of priorities to another. That's clearly seen Giotto's achievement in representing narrative and space and volume and light in the Arena Chapel, which dates to about 1305 or so. In this structure, probably built expressly for Giotto's paintings, and it's thought by some to actually have been designed by Giotto, we see cycles of the life of the Virgin Mary and of Jesus done in fresco on the walls of the chapel. And it's pretty striking when we look at one of the most famous scenes from this, the Lamentation of Christ, to see the degree to which Giotto certainly has abandoned that Byzantine style of the 13th century in favor of a bold and monumental naturalism, much more reminiscent in some ways of that Pisano baptistry pulpit panel. You can see a great deal of attention paid to the composition of the scene with a very clear emphasis on emotional connection of the viewers with, the sort of actors in the scene with the viewers and also amongst each other. And so in many ways this stands out as a kind of high point of Giotto's work in fresco especially. And it seems when we look at Giotto's work over his career that he favored, again, a kind of sober and monumental and very structured kind of approach to the visual arts. This was not always the case in the Italian peninsula. And so if we went, for instance, to the city of Siena, and we're looking down here on the Palazzo Pubblico right here, and the Campo, the big sort of open public square. This is the cathedral off in the upper right here. A different kind of pictorial emphasis is seen. Very clearly in the work of Duccio, for instance, in his Maestà, which dates from about 1308 through 1311, a much more flexible and lively sense of line and movement, along with a new emphasis, which I think is pretty striking in this piece and elsewhere, especially for such a sober and serious subject, a new emphasis on color, a sense of saturated and contrasting color, which tends not to be so much the case in Giotto's work. This is especially present in the predella scenes of the Maestà altarpiece. So, for instance, if we have the Arrest of Christ right here on the left, you can see lots of forms, movement, a kind of almost confusing mingling of characters here, where Giotto is very soberly kind of separated out everybody and made sure we can tell exactly how many people are here and what they're doing and all that kind of thing, as opposed to the much more confused and congested scene. But again, much truer perhaps to actual lived experience, that scene of Duccio's. One of the more important contributions, I think, of Siena as we come into the middle of the 14th century is an interest in what we might come to describe as genre painting, scenes of everyday life. We can see that this may well have represented Siena because we see the Siena Cathedral right up here and multiple towers that would have been typical of Italian hill towns in the 14th and even going to the 15th century. So this was in the Palazzo Pubblico, in a place where members of the city council would have met to deliberate on political issues, and it shows an image of the city under good government. If we look at the next scene, which is even more striking, we see the so-called contado, the more agricultural regions outside of Siena, which are still famous today, especially Chianti, for its wine production. So we have a very accurate depiction of what agricultural practices were like in this period.